In the year 70 AD, Roman legions sacked and burned Jerusalem. Israel would remain a nation in exile for nearly 2,000 years. But in the aftermath of World War II, the people of the book returned home. Israel's rebirth and survival in the 20th century has often been called a miracle. Those who were there cite their own experiences as proof. I'm Michael Greenspan. I'm an investigative journalist. These are their stories. The day began with a silent serenity reserved for only one day of the year. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest of Jewish holidays. By law, no one works. There are no trains, no buses, no taxis. No shops open their doors. There's no television or radio. The streets are silent. People of Israel are at rest and at prayer. Yom Kippur is a national day of reflection, prayer, and repentance, a day of atonement, when in biblical times the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies in the great temple at Jerusalem to ask God's forgiveness for the people's sins for the year before. But this was no ordinary Yom Kippur. This was October 6th, 1973. At precisely 2 p.m., more than 100,000 Egyptian soldiers invaded Israel's southern border. At the same moment, an armada of more than 1,000 Syrian tanks stormed across the Golan Heights to the north. With its army unmobilized and almost every Israeli soldier at home or at synagogue, Israel faced the possibility of total annihilation. In the weeks before, Prime Minister Golda Meir had dismissed the mounting signs of an invasion as meaningless. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan had encouraged her to believe that after Israel's lightning-fast victory in 1967, no one would dare mount such an invasion, and so she did nothing to stop it. Within hours, Egyptian forces were advancing north toward Jerusalem, while a massive Syrian tank armada raced across the Golan Heights toward Tel Aviv. They seemed unstoppable. If they reached Tel Aviv, the entire industrial and economic machinery of Israel would be destroyed. As Golda Meir watched her country face almost certain total destruction, the Prime Minister contemplated suicide. The cabinet drew up plans for a government in exile. Very few generals believed Israel would survive. With no one working, no radio, no television, no public transportation, the country was literally shut down. The first challenge was how to mobilize the nation's army and reserves in time to repel the massive armies thundering down on Israel from all sides. Young officers were quickly rounded up and dispatched to the neighborhood synagogues to gather the men of Israel for war.
רבותיי, אחיי המתפללים, יש מצב חירום, פיקוח נפש. בשעות אלה נערך גיוס מילואים. קצין צה"ל שהגיע אלינו יקריא שמות של מי מכם שצריכים להתגייס. יהיה אלוהים איתנו.
פרצה מלחמה. השמות שאני אקרא מתבקשים להגיע לנקודות האיסוף שנקבעו להם, באופן מיידי. יורם רוזנברג. אמיר ויינברג. חיים שגיא. שמעון דהן.
אל תדאג, אבא, נהיה בסדר.
אני אתפלל בשלומך כל יום.
תהיה בסדר.
רבי יורם, זה לא המקום שלו כאן. הוא צריך ללכת. הכל טוב לך, חביבי. תחזור בשלום.
אסא כהן. אפרים בר-לב.
Fathers and grandfathers embraced their sons and said goodbye. Brothers and best friends parted company. For many of them, this goodbye would be forever. But they knew there was no other way. The dream of Israel was won by sacrifice, and it would only be preserved by sacrifice. They were ready, if necessary, to die for that dream. And many would in the perilous hours just ahead. If ever there was a modern-day counterpart to the biblical story of young David facing down the Philistine giant Goliath, the Yom Kippur War was certainly it. Its eventual outcome was partly due to the young Davids of modern Israel, who dared to face the mouth of death and not back down. Avigdor Kahalani, a battalion tank commander in '73, was one of those young Davids.
The Syrians, they arrived from the east, they crossed the border, they bombed the minefields, and they put bridges on the anti-tank ditches, and they arrived close to us. And they start to hit our tanks. And my mission was to block them on the area north of the Kuneta. And it was hard because most of my tanks hit by the Syrian, and artillery shell was thousands of shell all over. And their aircraft, they bomb us like crazy, and we didn't have any Israeli aircraft to protect us.
But to understand how this brave young man faced down the Syrian Goliath in the Yom Kippur War requires first a look back to what happened to Avigdor Kahalani in the heat of battle during the Six-Day War 6 years earlier.
I was a company commander. I had 14 tanks. My mission was to cross the border in Gaza Strip. After a few hundred meters, they hit my tank, and I jumped to another tank. At the end of the day, I had a mission to go to El Arish, it's the capital of the Sinai. I was in the first tank. A few kilometers before the El Arish, we were in ambush. I was in the hospital almost a year. 60% of my body was burned. I had 16 operations, and after a year, I was allowed to go to the army, but they wanted to put me in the office. And I took the paper, and they wrote my medical profile 31. And in Israel, the maximum is 97. I took the paper, I cleaned it up, I wrote 97, and I go back to the tank.
Why in the world did you go on again?
You know, My father, when I joined to the army, he told me, look, my son, you're going to join the army. This is your turn. You're going to hold the flag on your hand and the flag of the country. Don't open the hand.
And when he saw and when you saw that you had survived all the injuries that you sustained during the 67 war, what did you feel about that?
It was a miracle for me to survive, to stand up, to go back to the tank. I'm talking about 73 war. It's few years after that. When I fought on the top of the tank, it was after 16 operations. And think just about the feeling that I had inside, that I was scared from the situation. Maybe I will go to some situation like I had a few years before that, and maybe I cannot control my body or my head.
So with all that fear that you had in your heart, that you might lose it in 73, tell me what happened to you in that war.
During the war, I was a battalion commander, and I had more than 40 tanks. It was hard combat in the Golan Heights. We lost 2/3 from the Golan Heights after less than 24 hours. My mission was to protect the area against the Syrian, and it was hard. We fought for 4 days, from Shabbat, is Yom Kippur, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. And the hardest day, it was during Tuesday that we almost lost the combat.
That Israel manages to hold on at all is beyond any logical explanation. More than 1,400 Syrian tanks have stormed across Israel's northern border in the opening hours and days of the war. Israel has fewer than 200 tanks with which to face this military Goliath. Saturday night, the first night of the war, Kahalani asks for Air Force support. It doesn't come. The Syrians have infrared night vision and strike with precision throughout the night. The Israelis can only fire into the darkness and hope to strike their enemy. Kahalani lines up his tanks and begins a barrage of gunfire into the valley beyond their position. Syrians are led to believe there's a vast Israeli armada facing them. That night, Israel holds the line.
During the night, I hit its Soviet tank, it's a Syrian tank. It was no far from me. And the commander, he jumped from the tank. He was in fire. It reminded me what happened during the 67.
To you. Sunday, the Syrians send hundreds of tanks into the battlefield, aiming with precision toward the commander's position on each Israeli tank in the field. Kahalani watches as many of his commanders, men he knows as friends, are struck down by enemy fire. By Tuesday, Israeli forces in the Golan are almost totally decimated. Kahalani is given an order by Janusz, his commander, to stand his ground in the valley below their position. He has only 7 tanks left to face the Syrian armada. But when Janusz asks Kahalani over the radio how many tanks he has, he answers 41, just in case the enemy was listening in, he later admits. What happened to you that day?
Usually when you shoot with tanks, it's a range 2 miles, something like that, 3 kilometers, more than that. I had situation that I found 4 tanks in the front of me, 25 meters, and I was alone.
יובל נותן בעלם כזה שהוא מעיף את כולנו קדימה. אני מסתכל, בחזית שלי 25 מטר, 3 טנקים T-62, ואני צריך להחליט מה אני עושה.
There is a special handle that I move the third and the main gun to the first tank, and I scream, oh my God, I shoot him! And he didn't know what to do. It was so close to him. You know what he asked me? Excuse me, sir, what is the range? I thought I'm going to kill him. I moved to another tank, and my loader put another shell, and he shot again. And when I put the main gun to the third one, I saw main gun of the Syrian tank looks straight to my face, is ready to shoot. And my gunner was screaming, yelling. I saw the 115 millimeter look straight to my eyes, and he was ready. This is some kind of a situation how we fought on the Golan Heights during the Yom Kippur.
יובל, אני חושב שאנחנו יכולים לזוז מפה. רעיון טוב, המפקד.
The battle for the Golan will ultimately come down to this final confrontation at a hilltop called Little Hermon, and the valley below it that will be known forever after as the Vale of Tears. If the Syrians make it past this point, nothing will stop them from storming across the Galilee, destroying Tiberias, Haifa, and ultimately Tel Aviv. Kahalani's remaining tanks have all taken Syrian hits. Many have lost commanders or whole crews. Command discipline is low. Morale is failing. Defeat is in the air. The scene that follows is reminiscent of young David in the Bible. Saul and the men of Israel were frozen in fear at the sight of the giant Goliath. Kahalani gives an order to his tank commanders to move forward. No one moves. He tries cajoling them, even starting forward himself. No other tank follows.
אני משתמש בנשק האחרון שאני מבין שאין לי כבר ברירה, ואני אומר ללוחמים שלי, תסתכלו על הסורים, תסתכלו איזה לוחמים טובים הם. מה קרה לנו? הלוא אנחנו יותר טובים מהם. תתחילו לנוע קדימה, הרבצתי שאגה לתוך הרשת, מה אני מזהה בגדוד שלי? פחדנים!
Kahalani had faced death in 1967 and survived, just as David had once faced down a bear and a lion that attacked his sheep. With their common experience and born on their shared faith in God to fight on their behalf, both young men refused to bow to fear. David stepped up to face Goliath. Kahalani ordered his tank to move forward. David had declared, "I come not with sword and shield, but in the name of the God of Israel." He carried only 5 stones into battle with his giant. Kahalani moves forward with only 7 tanks to face the massive Syrian armada. Kahalani's crippled tanks storm the hill before them, looking down at the once green valley, now blackened with the smoldering remains of hundreds of burning Syrian and Israeli tanks from 3 days of fierce fighting. Moving among them, hundreds of Syrian tanks continue their relentless advance. Kahalani orders his tanks to begin a barrage of gunfire on the advancing armada below, not expecting to stop them, but at least hoping to slow their advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Reinforcements don't come, but suddenly, to his amazement and without explanation, the Syrians seem struck with fear. The enemy armada begins retreating. Syrian soldiers begin running from the battlefield in all directions. Kahalani radios to Commander Janusz.
כאן 2, דוח מצב. כרגע אנחנו שולטים במצב, ארטילריה נפסקה. בקיצור, אנחנו שולטים בכל עבור. חיים, כאן 20, הכל בזכותך, תאמין לי. כל הכבוד לך, כל הכבוד. אתה גיבור ישראל, עבור. כאן 2, אנחנו כרגע ב-20 כאן, האויב פורע.
While Kahalani and his fellow soldiers are holding back the Syrian advance, They have no idea that they're part of another chain of events unfolding thousands of miles away from the battlefield, that many say is the real miracle story of this war. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, in turning down Golda Meir's request for arms to defend her country, is reported to have said, "Let the Israelis bleed a little." Golda Meir is desperate. Without help, Israel will not survive many more days of the pounding assault from all sides, despite all the Kahalanis and those like him who are bravely defending their homeland and sacrificing their lives on all the front lines. And so she picks up the phone and calls the private line of U.S. President Richard Nixon. It is 3 o'clock in the morning. Television film producer and documentarian Bill McKay's investigation of the American role in the Yom Kippur War describes what happened when President Nixon took Golda Meir's call in the middle of the night.
He said, I put my robe on, I sat on the edge of the presidential bed, and I heard Golda Meir pleading with me, Mr. President, if you don't help us, the Jewish people will never survive. He said something interesting, if not strange. He said, you know, I could almost hear my mother's voice. She would tell me stories and read to me from the Old Testament, the heroes of the Bible. And one afternoon she said, Richard, someday you're going to be in a position where you can help save the Jewish people. And when that day comes, you must do everything in your power. And he said at that moment I realized, maybe for the first time in my presidency, why I had become president of the United States. He was deep in Watergate, but he said I knew I had to do what I was born to do. And he said, Golda, what do you want? Well, she had her list.
It was the largest airlift of armaments since World War II. The president kept his word. Everything Golda asked for, she got. Every weapon, every vehicle, every piece of equipment, and all the ammunition to operate them. A virtual arsenal airlifted overnight to Israel's front lines.
And many military experts credit that decision, that request, at that moment, as the essential element that saved Israel from destruction.
In another striking parallel to David in the Bible, Richard Nixon turned aside the Goliath of indifference to Israel in his government, faced down a powerful Secretary of State who would turn against him, and accepted the threat to his own presidency to save Israel in its hour of need. Before it was over, the Yom Kippur War demonstrated one of the most incredible turnaround victories ever recorded in military history. Israel ultimately pushed the Syrian army to the gates of Damascus and the Egyptians to within a few kilometers of Cairo. In the Golan, Syria lost more than 1,000 tanks, nearly 900 of which were left abandoned on the battlefield. More than 3,500 Syrian soldiers died. Another 5,600 were wounded in combat. Nearly 500 were taken prisoner. For his bravery and valor in the Vale of Tears, Avigdor Kahalani was dubbed a hero of Israel and received the nation's highest accolade for courage in the defense of his country. He would only say that his men fought well and that it was a miracle that saved Israel that day. Syria would remain an adversary to Israel's existence, but in 1977, Egypt's Anwar Sadat again crossed the border. But this time, he came as the guest of Israel's parliament to address the Knesset.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
2 years later, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty, ending 30 years of conflict. Prime Minister Begin and Anwar Sadat were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. 15 years later, Jordan signed its own permanent peace treaty with Israel. Two of Israel's strongest adversaries had become firm partners for peace. The names chiseled into the stone are in Hebrew, but their language of courage and sacrifice are universal. Each of these names represents a soldier who gave their life in defense of this miracle that we call Israel. If there are real miracles, the greatest ones seem to require the greatest sacrifice as well. If Israel is to survive and prosper, it will likely require the continued sacrifices, who consider this miracle worth preserving, worth passing on to generations yet to come. And it will likely need many more miracles.